Let's take a closer look at the cells involved in the nervous system. The main cell that we talk about with the nervous system is the neuron. The neurons are the cells that actually carry the signals from one cell to the next. The main part of a neuron is called the cell body or the soma. This is where we find the nucleus and the other organelles such as the mitochondria, the ribosomes, the endoplasmic reticulum, etc. The dendrites are the part of the neuron that receive the signals. These are the parts of the neuron that are going to detect stimuli and then send the signals through the cell body to the axon. The axon is the part of the neuron that's going to carry the signal from the cell body to the next cell. The axon starts at a structure called the axon hillock. The axon hillock is important because this is where the cell makes the decision whether it's going to send the signal to the next cell or not. Lots of different stimuli could be detected from the dendrites, but the neuron as a whole has to integrate all that information and decide whether to send a signal to the next cell or not. And that decision takes place at the axon hillock. If there's enough stimulation to open voltage-gated channels at the axon hillock, then we're going to send a signal to the next cell. If there's not, and those voltage-gated channels remain closed, no signal is sent. As we saw when we were looking at motor units, one single axon can divide in order to innervate many different cells. So sometimes an axon can divide and send a branch to another cell, and those branches are called the axon collaterals. The end of the axon that's actually going to release the signal at a synapse with the other cell is called the axon terminal. The axon terminal often has a lot of small branches that allow it to really make a good connection to the target cell, so that when it sends the signal to the target cell will respond. Some axons are myelinated and some are not. The axon of the neuron at the top of the figure is not myelinated. The axon on the neuron at the bottom of the figure is myelinated. We can see these sections where we have myelin wrapped around and around the axon. This myelin sheath is made of layers and layers of membrane, so it contains a lot of proteins and a lot of lipids, and it serves as an insulation for the axon. The gaps along the axon between the myelin is where the signal will actually be transmitted. In a non-myelinated axon, the signal travels the entire length of the axon, and it travels relatively slow. We're talking about 1 to 2 meters per second is how fast the signal goes along an unmyelinated axon. In myelinated axons, the signal skips to these gaps between the sections of myelin. These gaps are called the nodes of Ranvier, and by transmitting the signal from node to node to node, it goes a lot faster. This is called saltatory conduction, and saltatory conduction along a myelinated axon can travel as fast as 120 meters per second. So that's a lot faster than an unmyelinated axon. When we talk about neurons or show pictures of neurons, we usually show a multipolar neuron. In a multipolar neuron, we have many dendrites from the cell body that are collecting information from many different directions and sending that to the cell body to then decide if we're going to send a signal out the axon. But not all neurons are multipolar. Some neurons are bipolar. Bipolar neurons have one dendrite that's going to detect information or stimuli from one spot, carry that to the cell body, which can then send that information on down the axon. And some neurons are unipolar, where the signal never even travels through the cell body. Instead, we have a dendrite that carries the signal directly to the axon that then carries it on to the next neuron. When we talk about the nervous system, we do tend to focus on the neurons as the cells that actually carry the signals, but there are a number of support cells that are important as well, and these are known as the neuroglia, or glia for short. These support cells are important for providing what the neurons need to be able to function. The central nervous system in particular contains a lot of glia, and this is because the central nervous system is protected by a structure called the blood-brain barrier. That separates the blood supply from the brain and the spinal cord. This is important to help provide protection to those important areas and help to maintain their unique environment, but it also means that there's none of the support that comes from the blood supply, so there have to be a lot of extra glia. Let's take a look at some of the glia that are found in the central nervous system, starting with the ependymal cells. The ependymal cells are glia that line the openings of the spinal cord and the brain. These cells provide part of the blood-brain barrier, keeping the nervous system separate from the blood supply. And they also produce the cerebral spinal fluid. The cerebral spinal fluid is the fluid that surrounds the spinal cord and the brain and acts as the blood for those organs, in that it provides the nutrients and provides a mechanism for removing wastes from those cells. The astrocytes are support cells that provide some structural support, and they also have a role to play in providing the blood-brain barrier. They interact with the capillaries directly to help separate the blood from the central nervous system. The astrocytes are also important for supplying vital nutrients and growth factors to the neurons of the central nervous system. Since the central nervous system is separated from the blood supply, we can't get macrophages from the blood to clean things up when we need to. So the central nervous system has its own macrophages called the microglia. The microglia are the cells that phagocytize foreign material or infectious particles or dead tissue that may be in the nervous system. The last of the central nervous system glia I want you to know about are the oligodendrocytes. The oligodendrocytes are important because these are the cells that produce the myelin sheath around the axons of the central nervous system neurons. The oligodendrocytes have extensions of their membrane that reach out and then wrap around and around and around the axons to provide the myelin sheath. Here's another figure showing an oligodendrocyte and the extensions that are wrapping around an axon in the central nervous system to provide the myelin sheath. So you can see where the myelin layers are, and you can see the nodes of Ranvier that allow for the saltatory conduction. If we take a look at the support cells that we find in the peripheral nervous system, there are far fewer, and that's because the nerves and ganglia in the peripheral nervous system have access to the blood supply, so they need less support from specialized cells. The one important glial cell that we do find associated with peripheral nervous system neurons is the Schwann cell. Schwann cells are the cells that create the myelin sheath around peripheral nervous system neurons. And in this case, instead of an extension of the cell, the whole Schwann cell wraps around and around and around the axons of the peripheral nervous system neurons in order to produce that myelin sheath.